We're lucky enough to have Graham Henderson, who has just been elected to the board of the Shelley Association of America, who is already on the board of the Unbinding Prometheus project here at the University of Pennsylvania, a man who has spent a good portion of his life fighting for the rights of artists, fighting for the rights of those who support and promote artists, a man who spent a great portion of his life encouraging those around him to read Percy Shelley, to be here tonight to talk to us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to introduce to you again, welcome back, Graham Henderson.
All right. I don't think that's going to work, Miranda. Oh well. Thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back at Van Pelt, and thank you, Eric, for inviting me. It's actually been a year, I think, to the day that I was here the last time. So what I want to do tonight is, as Eric said earlier, I've sort of changed up the presentation a little bit from what I'd originally intended. But what I want to do is sort of set a little scene, take you back into the time that Shelley visited there. And so just bear with me, and I've got a little video. So that is Lake Geneva from Montreux, looking west. Geneva is just around the corner down there. This is an ancient view. That's a view that Shelley and Byron would have seen. That's the castle of Chillon, where Byron and Shelley would have visited. Mont Blanc is in behind the mountains there. So this is on the east side of the lake. And the other place I want to take you to briefly is Diodati itself. Now, I had the Diodati is not open to the public. It's owned by a Rhodesian billionaire who has converted it to very, very expensive condos. And the land in Coligny in the south shore of Lake Geneva is among the most valuable land, apparently, real estate in the world. Looking straight across there, that's Geneva, and that's where the Hotel Angleterre was, that they rented out telescopes so people could watch them here in Diodati. I have a little piece coming on this on my own site, because this building is actually our only connection to what happened at that point in time. I think it's a tragedy that it's a bunch of condos, and you know, even so you don't get any sense. I mean, it would not have looked like that when they were there. It would have looked quite different. But you can't go in it. It's not, you know, it could have been converted to a museum. It's not a museum. But anyway, so that sort of will give you a little sense of Geneva at that point in time. And these scenes are quite tranquil. But as some of you are going to know, it was anything but tranquil in 1816. And I'll show you a little bit about why that was the case. The summer of 1816 is known as the year without summer. And Shelley had no way of anticipating that. On the right hand is a picture of the volcano that erupted in 1815. Tambora in Indonesia. It's just a visualization. Obviously, nobody was there with pen and ink and paper and paint to paint it at the time. But it was a super colossal event. There is a volcanic explosivity index, which is a VEI, which ranked what happened there at off the scale. It created a new number for it, 7. It was the world's largest eruption since 180 AD. It threw an enormous amount of volcanic material up into the atmosphere. And if you look on the left, you can see what that did to the temperature norms in Europe. And here, of course, is the sort of epicenter of it. I think it's 3.5 degrees on average lower than normal. This event also took place at a time when the sun was going through an unusual period called the Dalton minimum, and it was producing less radioactivity. So there was less radiant energy coming from the sun. The atmosphere was filled with dust clouds, and it created these very, very low temperatures. And it was into this mess that Shelley and Claire and Byron and Mary walked. That's Tambora today. It blew the entire top of the mountain off. And not only did that event take place, there were 4 other volcanic incidents, one on St. Vincent, one in Indonesia, one in Japan, one in the Philippines, all within a few years of this. So it all contributed to create this year without summer. And that's when Shelley arrives. Now, there's just his little itinerary. I think one thing to think about when we think about Shelley and his party and Geneva, there was nothing in his experience which could have prepared him for what he was about to walk into. It was supposed to be a summer vacation almost, obviously with the subtext that Claire was trying to get near Byron. But they could reasonably have expected summery weather. I've been there in the summer. It's absolutely gorgeous. They could have expected that. They didn't get it. They experienced snow in July, rain all the time, enormous thunderstorms. All of this showed up in the poetry. You sort of, why are they doing it? Why did people go here? Well, it was part of what was called the Grand Tour. And no young English aristocratic gentleman, or in some cases lady, could be expected to have finished their education without having taken a tour on the continent. And one of the places that you went on the Grand Tour was Mont Blanc. It's important to remember that also, this is 1816, and the Napoleonic Wars and the earlier wars, the French Revolution had only sort of had dominated the continent for a generation. So almost nobody had been on the continent other than the denizens. Nobody coming from England had been there. So Shelley, in trying to prepare himself for this visit, what could he have turned to? Today we go online, or we have tour guides. There actually were a couple of tour guides, very rare tour guides, but there were no photographs. And if he wanted to talk to somebody about what to expect at Mont Blanc or at Lake Geneva, the only people he really could have talked to were men of his father's generation, because nobody his age had been there. So I think it's useful to remember that he had no idea what he was getting himself into, that we know about him that he was a very hypersensitive man to begin with, prone to emotional episodes. So that's just a little bit of scene setting to sort of give you an idea. And that's his itinerary. Now, one thing I'd like to quickly do is, if that's going to work for me, is take you on a little excursion. So this is, this is Geneva. We're looking south to Mont Blanc. You can see it up there. To get to Mont Blanc, oh, and by the way, right here, where my little cursor is circling, that's where Diodati is. Right across here, somewhere in this little row here, is the Hotel Angleterre, which I went to. It's got a very, very nice bar in the basement now called the Leopard Lounge, which I recommend. I don't know that the Leopard Lounge was there when Shelley was. I do know that he didn't like it, and so they got around the corner. There was nobody around here on the other side at that point in time. So to get to Mont Blanc, you make your way down the valley here. We'll just come out a little bit. You turn right, following the Arve. This is the Arve River. And so far on your trip, you can see it's wide open. The hills are have grass on the top of them. There's no snow. This is where the first major town is Bonneville. There's Cluse, which he refers to. You move down here towards Cluse, and it's at Cluse that things start to get a little interesting. And it starts to narrow. And you can get a sense for that if we just roll around here a bit. See how it sort of narrows in? And then you go up here, and you're going towards a little town called Solange, which is right here. You can see that. I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy for you. But on the way up here, he encountered the first of two cascades. They're really quite dramatic, waterfalls that come down. I'll show you a picture of them later. So up to Solange, and then you're going to pivot again this way, and we'll come back up, come in a little bit, and this takes you to Cerveau, which sits up on the hill. And the old Imperial Highway, this is the Arve down in here, and the old Imperial Highway sort of ventures along the shoulder here. The new highway just bulls its way right up the river. From Cerveau, I've just sort of jumped ahead. It's on Google Maps, it's hard to take that corner. I practiced this a lot. And I found that when I took that corner, I kept getting in behind a mountain that I couldn't get behind. So when you look here, this is now where he talks about. Oh, see, there's that mountain.
There it is.
Yeah, there it is. And I can't. Oh, there. I'm out. But it's quite dramatic. This is where it closes in, and I'm going to read you a few excerpts in a minute. But I just sort of want you to get the sense. You go up here, it really closes in on you, and it does get really quite dramatic. You do have this sense that, oh my God, there's not, and it's from here that you can start to see Mont Blanc, and so you go up this very narrow gorge, and this is really quite dramatic. You can see how it dodges hard left, and we'll see if we can make the turn without going in behind that mountain. Oh, get up, and just down a little bit, maybe come out, and that's the valley. And just come across, you have Mont Blanc right up on the right. Now, you can see how there's glaciers here. We'll talk about those glaciers. In his day, those glaciers were right down on the floor. And there's one right at the back here. You can see some rocks. See that where the cursor is? There's some rocks back there. And it came around the glacier, and it spilled out right here. So the terminus point of the Mer de Glace was here. The Bosson, which I think is this one, was here. And I'll show you some pictures. I just want to read a few things that he wrote. It's uncanny, his description of this. It's the Cascade de l'Arpenaz. This is how he describes it. Two parts. The first fell from the overhanging brow of a black precipice on an enormous rock. The rock's right in the middle, precisely resembling some colossal Egyptian deity. He says it struck the head of the visionary image, and gracefully dividing there, and you can see exactly that, it fell from it in folds of foam, more like to cloud than water, imitating a veil of the most exquisite woof. Then united, concealing the lower part of the statue and hiding itself in a winding channel, it burst into a deeper fall. And I stood right at the bottom of that, and it thunders down on you. It's really quite spectacular. Now, here's some painting. Now, I found one of the, when I was in Chamonix, I went into a little bookstore, and I found a book of reproductions of paintings, lithographs dating from that time, by Gabriel Charton, I think his name is. The guy who has reproduced it, his name is Tony Astle. He's a mountain book aficionado, sells them, paintings, pictures, lithos, books, everything. He lives in England. I reached out to him. We've become sort of pen pals. He's an incredible source of paintings. And what I asked him was, so what did it look like? Can you send me some lithographs of what it would have looked like? Now, one of the curious things, considering, you know, this is sort of famous for the sublime, these pictures are all that's Cerveau up on the hill there. They're very picturesque. You don't get that sense of horror or doom that you do with some of the famous sublime paintings. However, and this is from up behind Cerveau, that little church is still there. I went in it. That valley is where it closes in. And this is where Shelley writes, the ravine, clothed with gigantic pines and black with its depth below, so deep that the very roaring of the untamable Arve which rolled through it could not be heard above. All was as much our own as if we had been the creators of such impressions in the minds of others as now occupied our own. Nature was the poet, whose harmony held our spirits more breathless than that of the divinest. That, another sort of very picturesque, this is from Solange. That's really where you get, it's a little bit further back down, sort of out of order here a bit, but this is a very famous view, and that's, people stopped in Solange. He stopped in Solange. We'll come back to what he did in Solange, a little bit of writing and registers. But that's where you would stop and you would stay on your way in and take a pause, and you could see Mont Blanc, which is the tall mountain in the background. When you get into that tight little valley, and I talked about it dodging left, right, turns left, that's when you're really entering what they call the Vale of Chamonix. And here's what he says. Mont Blanc was before us, but it was covered with cloud. And look at this. This is my picture. It covered with cloud. Its base, furrowed with dreadful gaps, was seen above. Pinnacles of snow, intolerably bright, part of the chain connected with Mont Blanc, shone through the clouds at intervals on high. And this comes the famous line, I never knew, I never imagined what mountains were before. The immensity of these aerial summits excited, when they suddenly burst upon the sight, a sentiment of ecstatic wonder not unallied to madness. And again, I think back to, I want to take you back. Think who he was, how unprepared, and the effect that it might have on him. When they entered the valley, in July, they had this experience. He says, we were traveling along the valley. Suddenly we heard a sound, as of a burst of smothered thunder rolling above. Yet there was something earthly in the sound that told us it could not be thunder. Our guide hastily pointed out to us a part of the mountain opposite from whence the sound came. It was an avalanche. In July.
Wow.
We saw the smoke of its path among the rocks and continued to hear at intervals the bursting of its fall. Very descriptive. It fell on the bed of a torrent which it displaced. You can just see this. And presently we saw its tawny-colored waters also spread themselves over the ravine, which was their couch. So, pretty dramatic entry. Avalanches, things that he wouldn't have experienced or understood, or all very unearthly. And today, I had a very similar experience. The 3 days that I was in there, it was very difficult to see the mountain. It was cloaked and hidden most of the time. It popped in, popped out. It gave a real air of mystery. But when it opened up, it was something to see. But I mentioned earlier that there were 2 glaciers, and he, of course, made a point of visiting them. And here is Mont Blanc, then and now, the Mer de Glace. Now, on the left, and unfortunately, my picture is not from where this is. The current extent of the glacier, it's miles. I think the glacier is 5 miles long there, and it spills right out onto the valley floor. There's this huge cavern, and here's how he describes it. It's about a league from the village. The river rolls forth impetuously from an arch of ice and spreads itself in many streams over a vast space of the valley, ravaged and laid bare by its inundations. You get that sense. It's very, very different now. And he talks also about these pinnacles. And until you get in there, you really don't know what the hell he's talking about, but this is what they look like. This is there are these little needles, and there's hundreds of them, and they stick up into the air, and some of them are very, very high. And you get a sense here of, so you can see one there. This is in the gorge of where the glacier used to be, and you can see that pinnacle that he's talking about. Now, to get to see the Mer de Glace, you have to take a little train now, and he would have gone on horseback, and you go up the side of the mountain and around the corner, and you get this view on the left. And there's a little hut, you can see it here, where you would write your name. You did some scribbling in there too. And you would enjoy this incredibly sublime view of this huge glacier. But on the right is my photograph from exactly almost that location. You can see all the same mountains. There's no glacier. You want to have a sort of a sense for climate change. That will do it. And here is another view. So to get down to the valley floor where you can actually find the remains of the glacier, you have to go down about 400 steps, long way down. And on your way down, you can see on the right there, they have little plaques. This one says, line of the glacier, 1985. So I drew a line on the other side about like where it would be. Height of the glacier, that's 30 years ago, gone. There's another glacier, which is Bosson, and there you can see it spilling down. This little church is still there. I went in it. And this is about where Bosson is now. And you can see on the right, it's not a really good picture, but you get a sense of how high up it is, and it's spilling right down onto the floor. And, you know, this had a huge impact on him. Here's a view from the other side, looking to Mont Blanc. Now, there's about 10,000 vertical feet between the valley floor and the top. So you're looking up 10,000 feet. So his experiences in this valley of that mountain and those two glaciers are what he used as the fodder to create his famous poem Mont Blanc. And it's one of his most effective uses of the imagery of the sublime, but it's also, I think, one of the most important of his sort of philosophical statements as well, because it develops his theory of the imagination. One thing, you know, for my own purposes, I'm trying to think, is there anything, I'm trying to put myself in his shoes. Is there anything, like what could happen to me that could replicate something like this? Now actually, when I reflect back on it, standing there and seeing no glacier,
right.
that had that effect. But I did actually have an experience like that in 1994 when I went to Mount Everest. Now, here is, this is I think it's the Pang La Pass. This pass is at 18,000 feet. So you're standing on the shoulder of a hill at 18,000 feet, which is higher than any mountain in North America. And in the background there, in that little panorama, there are, I think, 6 or 7 of the 14, 18, I think it's 14, 18, I think there are 14, roughly that, 8,000 meter peaks in the world. And I think about 6 of them are in this image. And obviously in the middle there, you can see it, is Everest. And in this picture, unfortunately, it doesn't have it, but it has this big plume that it blows. It creates its own weather system. So anyway, we got in there to Rongbuk Monastery, and when we got in there, it was completely covered in clouds, and it was so disappointing. It was late in the evening, and we got in our the Land Rovers, and we drove up the river, or the whatever they call it, the glacial till plain with the little river in it, to sort of get to this vantage point that's quite famous, where you get to see the north face of Everest clouds. And we were about to go back, and then all of a sudden, and Mont Blanc did this to me too, all of a sudden, as if somebody was pulling strings on a curtain, it opened, and this was there. Now, there are, interestingly, 10,000 vertical feet between where I was standing and the top of Mount Everest. It's 29,000 feet, and I was about 19,000 feet there. And I remember having that feeling, the skin crawling on the back of your hair stands up on the back of your neck. And I remember, they call it goddess, mother of the earth, Shomalumma. But the word that came into my head was killer. I just had this sense that is, and you did have this feeling that it's alive. I'm sort of getting the tingles right now thinking about it. So in a way that sort of duplicated that experience for me. But I think it's very hard. So I have an inkling of what must have been the surge of adrenaline and all that, what must have been going through his mind. So how did I feel? Well, I'll go back to Shelley's own words. He says, I never knew, I never imagined what mountains were before. The immensities of these aerial summits excited when they suddenly burst upon the sight, a sentiment of ecstatic wonder, not unallied to madness. And that's kind of the feeling I had. So it's possible. So now I want to take us away from Mont Blanc and the mountains, and I want to talk about the register. Because while in Chamonix, Shelley did some things for which he would become, I think, more famous in his lifetime than almost anything else he was to write. And in the registers around, and at hotels and mountain huts around Chamonix, he declared his political orientation and his atheism. We talked about this at my last seminar. It's an aspect of his career which I think has been diminished and ignored. When you read the biographies, there's a sentence or two. Even in Dawson's book on on Shelley, there's a paragraph. I actually think that this is an event of considerable importance. I think it's extremely important, and you're going to see why. There are 4 entries that he probably made. They are the subject of an absolutely brilliant article by a non-academic, Gavin De Beer, which is out of print, but I was able to get a copy of it in Cambridge. Wrote in 1958, where with the most incredible sleuth work, he was able to figure out and reconstruct. There wasn't one entry, there were 4 entries, at least. And so I'm going to tell you the story of one of them in particular, because we actually have one. A page from one of the registers was torn out by somebody, and it found its way to England, and it's now here. And that's me smiling and a little nervous. That's the Wren Library, one of the most beautiful, famous libraries in the world. And I'm on my way there to meet Nicholas Bell, who's the librarian and what a gig. He was one of the top librarians at British Library, and then he goes to be the head librarian at the Wren Library. So I was quite nervous, and I really had no idea what to expect. And when I got in there, he actually had put together for me a little presentation. It was closed that day, so he allowed me in, especially, the library was closed, but he allowed me in. I sort of thought I'd get 10 minutes. Like an hour and a half later, I'm leaving. Absolutely fascinating. And there is a picture of the little case display that he put together, and on the left, there it is. Lo and behold, there is the page from the register in which he declared his political orientation and his atheism. And I have to say, it kind of gave me some chills, and I wrote about this. When I first saw his signature, it actually kind of got emotional when I saw his signature. And I said, and there I am with Nicholas Bell. He was so gracious and so kind to me. There we are holding, and he actually let me hold it. It's like, wow. So what I want to do again is I'm just going to drop out of my PowerPoint, and I'm going to come down here, and then I'm going to go here, and we're going to have a look at it. Now, I've got a 30 meg file here, so we can really kind of dig in, right, if we wanted to. We could go way in, but I have some little excerpts. Point is, this is what it looks like. You can see, if we go to the top, there's a place up here for, you know, the date of your visit, the month, where you were, what your name is, where you were born, where your country, and where you're going. And then you have a little category on the right here, which is your occupation. And you can see, so we all think these people must have had fantastic handwriting. No, not fantastic handwriting. It's a big fat mess. There is our friend, our hero of the story, right in the middle. We're going to look at this much more closely, but it gives you sort of sense for it, right? Right to the top. And then, by the way, right down here in the bottom, I'll just point out, somebody has written, "These mountains are as molehills compared with those of my native country." And we think actually Claire wrote that. And I forget why they think Claire wrote that, but they think Claire wrote that. And she was she wrote something else somewhere else, and I think she was trying to impersonate somebody from the Far East. Anyway, you can also see here too, right? Like there's some quite, like look, right above the PBS, look, the Earl of Monmouth, and then down here at the bottom, the Earl of Darlington. There's lieutenants. Like, I think it's also important to remember, and I show you that too, is like, the people that were in Chamonix, it wasn't like Ryanair was dumping, yobs on beery weekends for 99 pounds. These were aristocrats, people with a lot of money on the grand tour. So whatever you wrote in here, like people were going to notice, right? And he knew that. So, all right, so that's I've got some nice little snippets that I've chopped away from it. So where are we at? Here we go. So, what did he write, and what is the fuss about? Well, there he is, Percy B. Shelley. And like I say, he let me ran my finger over that. That's so weird. And it says he's from Sussex, not the neatest handwriting there. And he's on his way to hell, L'Enfer. Now, I've often had this debate with people, and I will confess I was one of the ones. I kind of grew up thinking he didn't have a sense of humor. I actually think he had a pretty damn good sense of humor. This is kind of, there's a real element of sort of puckishness, and that's what, in fact, that's what Trelawney and Medwin and the others said. He's actually kind of a funny guy, maybe not always consciously. But anyway, underneath there we have, in I believe her handwriting, because it's slightly different, is Madam M.W.G. Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin. Sorry, Mary Wollstonecraft. I keep saying William Gibson. No, not the science fiction. No, it's William Godwin. She's from London, England, and also on her way to hell. Now, underneath here, and this is where it gets interesting, and we really don't have time to delve into this too much, but there's a name and a place heavily written out, and unless you knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't know what was there. But actually, when you look carefully, it's quite clear. This is the first of Madam, and then here is a J and a C, Jane Claremont, which is how she was then known. And over here, C-L-I-F-T-O-N, Clifton, which is where she was from. If you didn't know she was from Clifton, and if you didn't know that Claire was there, you would probably have had a hell of a time figuring out what that was. But it's very clearly Claire, and her name is very clearly crossed out. And interestingly, she is not on her way to hell, although I think she might have disagreed. Apparently in old age she had a few opinions about our friend Shelley and others. It's a sort of joke. No? Okay. So now we get to the meat of the issue. I have read about this for so many different years, and everybody has a different vision or view of what exactly he wrote in what order. Some people say it was almost everybody uses the word philanthropist, and then Democrat and atheist, but they're always jumbled and they're mixed up. They're never in the same damn order. Well, now we know that he says on the top line, he says, "I am a lover of mankind, a Democrat. Now, PMS Dawson says that there's an implication that he says utter Democrat, like to kind of, that the way that the Greek is susceptible of that interpretation. And I'm an atheist. Now, I wrote an article about this, and one of the comments I made was, like, if you said that to somebody today, that hey, I'm a philanthropist. Oh, what do you give money to? I'm a Democrat, like Hillary? I do. And I'm an atheist. Well, none of that is exceptional. None of that is unusual. But at the time, those were all three incendiary terms, and we'll sort of understand why. First of all, it is the word, the Greek is philanthropos tropos, and it means I'm a lover of humanity. The term was coined by Aeschylus. It appears in Prometheus Bound. Shelley would have known that. And it was used by Aeschylus to describe Prometheus. Prometheus loved humanity. Lover of humanity. Now, that term was picked up by Plato. It was commented on all the way through the Middle Ages, and it, including by Bacon, who was one of Shelley's top favorite authors.
But just to be clear, Graham, it does not appear in the archaic Greek of Homer. This is a classical Greek term.
Correct. The first use of it is by Aeschylus.
Okay.
Yeah, so not in Homer. Bacon, and I think you've got to remember this, what did Bacon, and Shelley's reading Bacon, so what does the term mean to Bacon? He considered it to be synonymous with goodness, and he connected it with Aristotle's idea of virtue. So Shelley's, he must have known this, and I make the point in the article that I wrote for you, which we haven't published or anything yet, but I think this suggests a very interesting line of inquiry which I have not seen pursued. And it is the degree to which, because remember, later on we get to Prometheus Unbound, right? So it becomes, he's within 3 years or 2 years of writing that. It's the degree to which he identifies, he's describing himself as Prometheus. I am the lover of humanity. I am Prometheus. And then later he writes a poem about Prometheus. And it makes me wonder the degree to which it's more autobiographical than we might think. Now, while his claim to be an atheist attracted most of the attention, and boy did it ever, to be a Democrat was very clearly inflammatory. A lover of humanity, obviously it was revolutionary in tone, anti-religious. To be an atheist, or a philanthropist, or a Democrat, and Shelley was all three, was to be fundamentally opposed to the ruling order. And Shelley wanted the world to know that. Now, what made Shelley's atheism even more likely to occasion outrage is the fact that one of the reasons that proper English men and women went to Mont Blanc was to experience the sublime and to see God. And there was a very famous poem by some guy called Coleridge, called Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix. And he had very famously asked, every English person with any education would have known this poem, and what Coleridge asked was, who could be an atheist in this valley of wonders? Now, number one, we now know that, well, we knew then, we've always known that Coleridge, first of all, was never there. And secondly, it's a plagiarized poem from a Greek poet. So, completely plagiarized. So, but Shelley, I believe he went there, he had that in his mind, there's a lot of things going on in his mind. His answer to Coleridge, who could be an atheist in this valley of wonders? I can. I can be. Now, here is one of the reactions. Now, by the way, this was also, I should say, the inscriptions in Greek. I love the fact, like today we think, oh, he must have been, it's code. He's writing in Greek so nobody can read it. No, everybody knew Greek then. I mean, that's practically all you studied at university was Greek and Latin. Like literature was optional. So I don't think that's a joke. I think that,
yeah, no, literature did not come into broad general study until the 19th century. Literature was a matter for clubs, for
right.
the private enjoyment of the students together.
Yeah.
but all the main lectures were given in Latin, and your education from being a schoolboy, anyone who's middle class even, would have had a study of Greek and Latin at the very center of their education.
It was also at this exact juncture being associated as with the language of intellectual liberty. Despite the fact that it's being taught in stuffy old Oxford and Cambridge, it had that association. And Timothy Webb makes this point that it was written in the language of intellectual liberty, the language of those courageous philosophers who defied political and religious tyranny in their allegiance to the truth. So, calculated decision to write it in Greek. He's not hiding it. He's making a point. Here's one of the reactions. Mr. Shelley is understood to be the person who, after gazing on Blanc, this is in a newspaper, registered himself in the album as Percy Bysshe Shelley, atheist. Which gross and cheap bravado he, with the natural tact of the new school, took for a display of philosophic courage. And his obscure muse has been since constantly spreading all her foulness of those doctrines, which a decent infidel would treat with respect. He could respect an infidel, not an atheist. And in which the wise and honorable have in all ages found the perfection of wisdom and virtue. So, it engendered, and Southey found, oh my God, everybody knew it. Like I say, he was probably more famous for this than almost anybody else, anything else he wrote. However, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, did he write, what did he write? Well, that's not his handwriting. I sent it to a Greek friend of mine, and Gavin De Beer makes the same point. A friend of mine in Athens, very respected Greek lawyer by the name of Stathis Potamidis. And I'm not going to hold it against him that he prefers Byron to Shelley. But anyway, but that's a different hand. And here's what it says. Basically, it says in Greek, the fool said in his heart, there is no God. That's what it says. And apparently that Greek is perfect. There's been some people who quibble with Shelley's Greek. He made a couple spelling mistakes. But it was also pointed out by Gavin De Beer that it's metrically Homeric. And so while he might have not been so great with the Shelley, that it's got a perfect metrical line. And of course we all know that our friend Shelley was a genius with genius metrician, right?
So Graham, are we saying that the first line, the top line,
that's Shelley.
That is Shelley.
Yeah.
The next line appears to be a comment about Shelley from another traveller writing on.
Yeah, it's a rebuke. The fool.
From St. Anselm.
And it's quoting the Psalms 14, and we'll talk about that in a sec, but yeah, Psalms. Now, also, just to make his point very clear, we'll just step back out. So here it is, the fool, underlined, and then over here, underlined. So he's making it, the person doing the rebuke is making it very clear that this is the fool.
Right.
Now, why did he use that term? Well, the opening words of Psalm 14, verse 1, have for centuries been used by Christians to assail atheists. The fool of the line, the fool hath said in his heart there is no God, is assumed to be an atheist. Now, interestingly, this is a mistake. Because the second half of the verse goes on to say, they are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. Now, the assumption is often made that the they refers to an atheist, but Psalms lines 2 and 3 go on to make it very clear that God looks down on all people as corrupt. So, that's just a little sidelight. Point is, the rebuker is following in the footsteps of centuries of abuse of atheists who use that line. So now, what set Shelley off? Well, I think Coleridge, I think a lot of things were conspiring, but it is entirely possible that it was this. And this is a line. I think I showed it to you. It sort of starts off at the top. And this guy is basically saying, he's basically making the Coleridge point, that you come in here and you're inspired most forcibly. What does this all make you think of? Most forcibly, the love of God. And it's Chamonix, July, his initials, Methodist. No. So I sort of wonder, I can sort of imagine Shelley, he's got something in his mind, it's rattling around, he's not sure quite what he's going to do with it, and he walks in, and he goes to write in the register, and the first thing he sees is that. So, and there are those who think that it was that got him, set him off.
Sorry, Graham.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that this register is most likely to be the first register where Shelley writes philanthropist?
It could be. We're not sure which is the first.
So
it's likely to be. It's very likely to have been the first.
Do you understand why I'm making the point? Because if he's exchanging the love of God for the lover of man, and it's in response to this quote on the page before him.
Yeah, I should read it. He says, "How infinitely we are removed from all of these but one." It covers, this guy wrote on the other page, which we don't have. He says, "How infinitely we are removed from all of these but one. We are most powerfully excited to approach him by that one. When he commands us, we cannot command him. When he judges us, we cannot judge him. But when he loves us, oh, assuredly we can love him. Such scenes as these then inspire most forcibly the love of God." And then he sets himself up, right, as the lover of humanity, right underneath. We don't know who that person CM is.
Well,
now,
would printing have the effect of italics? Is that why it's not?
Well, that's interesting. Could have. Yeah, because he's the love of God is printed. Yeah. Now, Shelley wasn't the only one who thought amiss of this. Immediately under it, somebody else has written, "Why are people so anxious to make themselves ridiculous
in the eyes of everybody?"
In the eyes of everybody. What nonsense. So somebody else obviously thought it was ridiculous too. That I actually, it's very popular now, right, to reimagine things like this as tweets.
Yeah, it's like a Facebook conversation.
You could totally see this as a set of tweets, right?
And because he's identified himself as a Methodist, then we have this whole class thing going back and forth, since we know the class of most of the people writing here. So they're setting themselves up as, Church of England.
Methodists weren't.
No, Methodists, no. They were insurgent middle class people, and they set a different tone. They had a tone that was totally at odds with the restraint of the upper class.
So you asked, was it the first? So I did a little map for everybody. So we can see here at Solange, Gavin de Beer has the most amazing, like I said, what's a sort of investigative reporting. There was one in Solange, which is down there. There was one in the Hotel d'Angleterre, which is alongside the Hotel de Londres, so in two different hotels writing. And then up here, remember I had that picture, those three little people standing looking at the Mer de Glace, and I pointed to that hut, and in that hut. So those are the four places that we know of. And here's what, we know what that, in Hotel Angleterre, what he wrote was this. Now this is based on eyewitness reports, so we do not have these registers. But in Hotel d'Angleterre, he wrote, "Democrat, great lover of mankind, and atheist," different order. And the rebuke in that case, there was one in each case, "If he speaks the truth, a fool, if not a liar." And we know this because somebody very carefully copied it out and published it in a newspaper. And it said that it was in Hotel d'Angleterre. In Montenvers, up on the hill, up in the mountain there, in the hut, he wrote, "One and all atheists." And the rebuke there was, if this is true, they are fools and miserable revelers in their folly. If not true, they are one and all liars. Now, this was seen by a lot of people, including, this was the one that Southey saw and reacted to and wrote about. And then in Ceylon, that little one, that on the way, and either on the way in or the way out, he simply wrote the word atheist, and the rebuke was possibly just fool. This was seen and possibly erased by Byron. Now, there is a legend that grew up, and we're not going to get into it, but there's a big issue about whether Byron did or didn't cross things out. I remember when I first saw the, Ross Wilson at Trinity College thought the same thing that I did, as did Nicholas Bell, that what, the underlining of Shelley's name in Fool, that's way more in Byron's character than crossing something out. And so, I'm trying to imagine Byron, my friend Shelley might get in some trouble. Let's make sure he doesn't get in trouble. Like, who thinks that's Byron? Like, anyway, so I may be totally wrong, but here, De Beer thinks that this is, if there was an erasing, this is where it probably happened. Now we're getting to sort of the summing up here. So we have a very important set of statements in which Shelley deliberately, intentionally, and provocatively nailed his colors to the mast, knowing full well it would be read and would inflame passions. So I want to put it in the starkest possible terms. What was he saying? And here's what he was saying. I am against God. I am against the king. I am the modern Prometheus, and I will steal God's fire, and I will bring down the thrones, and I will empower the people. Might be a bit dramatic, but I think that's what he's saying to the world. That is an incredibly revolutionary dictum, and he was developing a system to deliver on that promise. And that's what I want to talk about now. His first avenue of attack was to use his skepticism, which he was very, very familiar with through Sir William Drummond and David Hume and Cicero and the early Greeks. If you're like me, I believe that he was a skeptic pretty much through and through. Other people aren't so sure. But one thing we do know about skeptics was that they used their skepticism to undermine authority and to attack all truth claims. And so Shelley, that's his first avenue of attack to realize his promise to empower the people. And here is a good quote from Shelley in that regard. He says, implicit faith and fearless inquiry have in all ages been irreconcilable enemies. Unrestrained philosophy in every age opposed itself to the reveries of credulity and fanaticism. The second avenue of attack was the imagination, his theory of the imagination. Now, why did that matter? And here we have to sort of think about how the contemporary theory of a revolution was changing. Up until Thomas Paine, most revolutions were violent and they involved a change in the form of government or personnel running the government. So along comes Thomas Paine, and by the way, Thomas Paine was a very real influence and often ignored influence on Shelley. But then revolutions started to be thought about in terms of principles and practices. And then Shelley comes along, builds on all of that, and starts to think about revolutions in terms of morality. For Shelley, a revolution was accomplished first and foremost by a change in one's moral character. And we've got to remember something here that, again, is not often commented on by Shelley. He was a philosophical anarchist, and Godwin as well. He didn't believe in government. He had a very kooky idea about what government should look like. Tiny, little, hard, I think he had the idea that juries would be involved. But whatever he did or didn't think, whatever the exact theory was, what it meant was, you don't have a government telling you what to do, then you need to have self-rule. So you have to have a perfected inner moral self. So we also know that he thought revolutions failed. Well, let's back up. Why did he think revolutions failed? Because he did. And why did he think that there was this cycle of revolution, sort of a tyrant, and then a revolutionary overthrow, and then that person who overthrew the first tyrant becomes a tyrant? Then there's another revolution, and there's this endless cycle. Well, why did he think that? So what I was going to put up was the lines from The Triumph of Life, lines 208 to 15. You remember in The Triumph of Life, he's having this vision, and he sees all these people milling by. And then all of a sudden, he sort of sees this, what looks like a Roman triumphal procession going by. So he's, at this point, there's this disembodied voice that's telling him what's going on. And so Shelley says, well, who are those chained to the car? And if you think back to your Roman triumphs, remember the emperor like Caesar would come back from Gaul, and he would have all of the kings and their wives and everybody in chains behind him. So he asks, well, who are those chained to the car? And the answer is the wise, the great, the unforgotten, they who wore mitres and helms and crowns, or wreaths of light, signs of thoughts, empire over thought. So there are civil leaders, political leaders, military leaders. Their lore taught them not this, to know themselves. Their might, and this is such a famous line, their might could not repress the mutiny within. And for the morn of truth that they feigned, deep night caught them ere evening. What he's saying, we see the problem in a nutshell. You've got these civil, military, and political leaders. They are, it solves sort of this puzzling idea of his. And you talked about this during the MOOC, like, why are rulers slaves? How can that be? And here we've got them, they're slaves. Well, Asia in Prometheus Unbound gives us a clue, because she says all spirits are enslaved who serve things evil. Well, that would include, in particular, in Shelley's mind, somebody like Napoleon. Dawson's point is that only a slave can be a tyrant. Only a person devoid of the liberty of self-rule can enslave others. And self-rule is only possible if there is a revolution in a man or woman's moral character. Otherwise, they're slave. And again, we're here to talk about the current. I'm trying to bring it slowly up to date. And at this point, you should start thinking about the Trumps of the world and the extent to which they are slaves to their baser instincts. So how do we deal with it? Well, in Shelley's theory, it's the education of the imagination. The world must be transformed in imagination before it can be changed politically. And here it is that the creator can exert a direct influence. So Shelley has his theory of the imagination, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how the creator, what role the creator could play then and can play now. So we alluded to, what's Shelley got in his toolbox. So he's identified the problem. Rulers are slaves to their baser instincts. They have no sense of self-rule. And Shelley would say, for example, that the debacle that was the French Revolution, and remember, he was one of the very few, like Byron thought Napoleon was great. Might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but he wasn't the only one. Shelley thought it was terrible. It became a debacle which could have been avoided had its leaders had a better moral character. And in my view, Prometheus Unbound offers a beautifully encapsulated vision of this in practice. Prometheus is enslaved by his own defective moral character. Prometheus is freed by his determination to rule himself. And Act 3 clearly presents Prometheus's ascent, this is Dawson's words, ascent to the autonomy of self-rule as an example for humanity to follow. Thus, an imaginative revolution is both the subject of Prometheus Unbound, so he's telling you about that, and its intended effect. How? And so now I want to talk, and then we'll be wrapping up at this point. Now I want to talk about the role of the poet, and we get that mostly from the our friend the Defense of Poetry. But we have to remember that in the Defense of the Poetry, he was responding to, I forget whose, Peacock, yeah, Peacock's attack. But frankly, I believe he's just talking about creators. And that's just how I choose to. And he talked about poetry could be creators. And of course, we have his famous line, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." But I think one thing that is important, I've got one last thought here. One thing that's important here is he says they're unacknowledged legislators, but he's saying they're legislators. So we might as well just drop the unacknowledged part and just say poets are creators are the legislators of the world. What does that mean? So he does not use this word in the sense of lawgiver. In the English political tradition, legislator is thought of being a representative or even a delegate of the governed, less a ruler than the aide of a ruler. And so the historical tradition, if you think back to Plato, the philosopher kings, they would pass edicts and tell people how to govern their lives. For Shelley, no. They're delegates of humanity. I got to stop using the word poet. Creators, here's Dawson on it. Creators do not influence society by imposing their ideas on it. They influence, they possess us based on the fact that their creations are the representatives of the hopes and desires of all men. He says men, writing in 1970s, so that's a quote. All people. Creators guide the general will by expressing it, and therefore poetry can produce social change, just as social change can produce poetry. And again, think about what we need right now. Creators do not represent their age by passively reflecting it, but by participating in what is dynamic and progressive in it. They look beyond opinion in its fixed and dead form of custom and attach themselves to the new currents of feeling that are moving toward beneficial change. And finally, I think I just want to talk about the world that we are now living into, which is increasingly being called the post-truth world. Why is the imagination important now? Why are creators important? Shelley would say that poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination. And just go back to that point that I made earlier, that Prometheus Unbound, the imaginative revolution, is both the subject of it and the intended effect of it. So simply by reading it, by immersing yourself in the poetic experience, you are enlarging the circumference of your imagination. Art, by calling on the imaginative resources of its audience, stimulates their development and thus prepares the audience for autonomous moral activity. And again, keeping in mind the crazy world that we have lived into, the post-truth world, where lies abound on the internet, For Shelley, the imagination has an ordering facility. Our experience of the world is chaotic, swirls of unorganized impressions, some of them, calculated by the Trumps of the world. But our imagination allows us to create a unity out of all of these diverse materials, but only if it's cultivated. So, today, what does this tell us? That our creators are more important than ever, and that they'd better speak up, and that we'd better listen to them. But also, too, we need to create a new narrative around this, because it's not just truth that is under attack. If you think about the efforts by Republican governors right across the country, and it's happening elsewhere, believe me, to roll back support for the humanities, we have to turn that right around on its tail, because it's the humanities. And think of, again, lover of humanity, humanities. Remember, Prometheus did not just give science to men and women. He gave the whole kit and caboodle, and just as important was language and the liberal arts and everything else. So that, Eric, Alan Weinstein, and treasured friends of the Penn Shelley Seminar, is my presentation on our topic.